So we saw between 2005 and 2009 this fall in household wealth, and basically families could no longer use their homes as ATMs. And let's combine that with the squeeze in the states. You're all seeing that in California. Combine that with federal deficits at the federal level and what impact that might have on student aid. And I think what this all equals in the end is that families are paying or going to be paying more out of pocket for higher education. And when that happens, I think perhaps they're going to be making different choices. They're going to be asking a lot more about value of higher education. And so we're going to see a shift from simply talking about price of higher education to asking more about the value of higher education. And this is where the public and college presidents in particular disagree. And I think this is a very similar slide to what Jane Wellman had in her presentation this morning. We asked last spring, the Chronicle and the Pew Research Center asked college presidents and the public at large about the value of American higher education. And we said, we asked them, can you rate the job the American higher education system does in providing value for your money? We didn't ask them straight about cost. We had asked them about value. And we asked the same question of college presidents and of the public. And on this slide, the public is represented by the orange rust color, and blue represents presidents. And as you can see, presidents are mostly at the top. They think excellent, good value. Public, mostly at the bottom. They think only fair or poor. And I think there's obviously a big divide between college presidents and the public on this question. And I think that this is key to where American higher education is going and asking about the value of what you get for what you pay for. And so what are some of the questions that the public is now asking when they think about American higher ed? How and what will I learn? Bob talked a little bit this morning about Academically Adrift, and I understand there's some skepticism about that book. But I think personally that the authors did a very good job at trying to measure a very difficult thing to measure in American higher ed, which is learning. Will I get a job? I think that there is obviously this debate in American higher ed about whether its purpose is to get a job or to be broadly educated. I personally think you can do both. I don't think it's an either-or argument, although some people try to force it into an either-or argument. And then finally, will I make enough money to pay off my debt? And I think this is becoming a much bigger question in the minds of families. We saw it last fall in the Occupy Wall Street movement, where debt, and where college debt in particular, became a very big question during those debates. And finally, I think that traditional colleges have a hard time answering a lot of these questions. I think that some colleges have a really hard time explaining to families what students learn in the classroom. I don't think they can necessarily prove that what they're going to do will necessarily lead to a job. And of course, some schools are graduating students with high debt burdens, and obviously then they have a hard time explaining how those students are going to pay off that debt. And so I think that this is going to lead in the coming years to a more fundamental question about what is college. And I think everybody in this room has a version or a definition about what is college. And I think they're probably all correct in some way. But since I'm talking a little bit about disruption in the higher ed category today, I want to approach this more from a market standpoint. And to me, college is a bundle of services that results in an education with internal and external value. The internal value is all obviously to the individual. We talk a lot about whether higher ed is a private good or a public good. The internal is more about what you learn as an individual, and the external value is what you give to the marketplace, what you give to employers as a signal that you know what you're doing potentially for the job. And so this is obviously a more practical definition. I think if I asked any of you what you think college is, we would, I think, hear a lot of good comments on that. But this is what I think is a bundle of services that results in an education with internal and external value. And so to me, as we think about what is the future of higher ed and where the disruption in the higher ed market could happen, I think we have to ask, what are the less tangible aspects that define the college experience that can't be easily replaced by fragmented, simplified services on the internet? So let's think about what the internet and what the web did to newspapers, to music, and to bookstores. It took this bundled approach and went after what I would call the low-hanging fruit at first. And so as you think about the college experience, what are the things that are most at risk in the traditional college experience today, and what potentially are least at risk in the traditional college experience? So here's what I think is potentially most at risk as we think about the traditional college experience. First are lower level and core courses. Any one of us today can go online and find high quality courses in history, math, economics, philosophy, or on basically any topic that interests us. Some of the courses are pretty bad. In fact, some of the courses are really bad. But some of them, I think, are better than what you'll find at many colleges these days. And the result is that I think the intro courses at most colleges are quickly turning into commodities. And about the only thing protecting them right now are the pricing and credit models for most colleges. Obviously, most colleges charge students by the semester, and of course, the big one is that colleges have the final authority on which credits to accept. The second thing is the network. Colleges sell the experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And part of that experience is being part of a network, an alumni network that allows you to leverage common connections for various gains in your personal life and professional life. But online networks today, I think, provide anyone to create their own affinity groups, very much like they would have created on college campuses. In some ways, they can narrowly tailor these groups and interest more than if they could do them through alumni groups. So I think there's one advantage that colleges do hold here, and that over social networks online is that they have this ability to bring together alumni face-to-face, where online you can't do that, at least not yet. And finally, what I think is most at risk is this idea of a credential. I still think that we all know that a college credential is probably the best signal to employers that you're ready for work. But if employers increasingly get dissatisfied with the quality of some college graduates, and there is a lot of evidence out there that they are unhappy with the quality of some, not all, college graduates, I think that some employers are going to begin turning to alternatives that signal to them somebody has acquired skills and expertise. And we've heard a lot about two big areas in this realm. One is badges, and this is this idea that you can take online courses and be certified in a different way through an online badge. This has been very popular over the years in the technology field. So if you learned a specific programming language, you would be certified in that language. I actually thought this was kind of a goofy concept, to be honest with you, in higher ed for the longest time. But last fall, this got a big boost by the Macarthur Foundation, the same foundation that gives out the Genius Awards, as they think about how to come up with a national system of badges. And Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, is also a big fan of these badges. And so if you could come up with a system to kind of certify badges, what happens then? And I think also that you're going to see other institutions besides higher ed institutions give out these badges. The other thing on the credential is places like MIT. MIT announced in the fall or in December, MIT X, where again MIT was of course the leader in the open courseware movement about a decade ago, and you could take courses at MIT, but you had nothing to show for it at the end of the day. Now they're actually going to give out not an MIT degree, but a credential to certify learning. And as more and more institutions move in that direction, you potentially can see other institutions besides colleges kind of chip away at the margins. Do I think that a CSU degree from Long Beach is necessarily at risk? Probably not. But how about a lot of these credential programs that I talked about that were started in the last 10 years, short-term certificates, even some 2-year degrees and some 4-year degrees in areas that we didn't quite need a credential for 20 years ago. Could those potentially be at risk by these alternatives? Perhaps. And so I think those are the 3 biggest things at risk in the coming disruption. What do I think is least at risk? So I talked a little bit about the experience. For many who go to a residential college, the time spent there is often some of the most rewarding parts of their lives. Friendships are born, marriages are set, and business relationships begin. A lot has been made of people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg who dropped out of Harvard to start these multi-billion-dollar businesses, and isn't that great? Everybody should follow their lead. But the key, I think, for especially somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, if you saw the movie Social Network, is that I don't think, and I think he even agrees with this, he would not have been able to create Facebook if he had not been living at Harvard during that time. It was the relationships that were built in the residence halls, in classes, and elsewhere that allowed him to build Facebook. Or if you believe the alternative, obviously, he just stole the idea from somebody else. But anyway, I think that there are the relationships that are born not only in the residential experience, but just even in the classroom experience. And that face-to-face classroom experience. And that can't be easily copied online. Secondly is this idea of maturing students. And this is one of my biggest issues about this don't go to college movement, because I think it really ignores one key argument for 18 to 24-year-olds. And that basically is that I'm not quite sure, I know I wasn't, and probably most of you in this room weren't, really quite ready to move right into the workforce and to begin life at the age of 18. And I think there's this important part of college that matures students. And that, again, cannot be easily copied by other providers of higher ed. And then finally, and I think probably the most important part, the most important thing that I think colleges have going for them is this idea of the student-professor relationship. I think that if you ask almost any college graduate about their college experience, they will always talk about a professor or professors that changed their lives. And I think that's really hard to replicate against in a kind of a DIY educational environment where you're kind of cobbling together your own educational experiences, because you're never going to have those student-professor relationships. I think one of the most ironic things is that I think this is actually what differentiates colleges most from these new competitors. And probably most ironic about this is, again, if you look at Jane's slides from this morning, is that this is actually where colleges have been investing the least amount of money. We've been adding more adjuncts, more part-time professors, which in some cases may break down those student-professor relationships, and we might not have what we used to have 10 or 15 years ago. And this is actually one of the pieces, I think, that differentiates traditional colleges more than anything. So this, the climbing wall, I think, has been kind of the symbol of American higher education over the last 20 years. This idea that there's been this huge growth in student services. I think that the academically adrift folks talk about this a lot, that kind of colleges got away from their core mission over the last 10, 15, 20 years. If you believe that we are about to move into a period where colleges will begin to unbundle their services and let others maybe take over for where they may not be able to perform well, perhaps the next decade could actually be defined more by academic rigor. And this is where I think, again, what differentiates colleges from these other providers? And I think this is one area where if colleges for the last 20 years sold the student experience, sold the idea of we offer the best dining services, the best residence halls, we have the climbing walls or the lazy rivers, which were started, by the way, at both private colleges and public colleges across the country, could the classroom experience once again become what institutions sell as they try to compete against all these new competitors entering the marketplace in the coming year. I want to go back to the last decade because I don't think that higher ed is necessarily starting from a position of strength right now. I mean, in what you see in Jane's numbers and what King Alexander talked about this morning, the last couple of years in particular has been really tough for higher ed. And I always wonder now if the years right before the Great Recession were kind of a lost decade for higher ed. We had all these new students entering the system. We had these new credential programs being created. We had this huge demand. And that was really a time, I think, for higher ed to kind of reflect, figure out what it was doing right, figure out what it was doing wrong, and becoming more focused. A couple of weeks ago, I had a chance to participate in a conversation about the future of higher ed. And one of the things about the people in the room, and there were people from institutions, from the government, and entrepreneurs. And one of the things that really has surprised me in the last couple of months is the amount of private equity money, Wall Street money, and just money in general that wants to get into this market because of the opportunities that they see. But one of the things that everyone in the room agreed with is that this is really hard work, trying to figure out what's next in higher ed. And so we came up with a series of questions that we think potentially can help higher ed as we move in the next couple of years as a guide. One of them is, what's your ambition? And this could mean for a department, it can mean for an institution. You're trying to figure out what is really your ambition. Is your ambition, as I think some presidents think, to move up in the rankings of the US News and World Report rankings? I have a lot of presidents who come through my office who say that's a goal. Well, that's fine. Let's say that and publicly say that. And you'll have to figure out how to do that. But what is your ambition? Where are you going to play? Meaning, what are you going to focus on? How are you going to win in those areas? I think one of the things that we saw over the last decade is that higher education tried to play everywhere and win everywhere. And that was really not possible. What actions are going to enable you to do that? And finally, how do you drive change within your organization? These are the guiding questions. We didn't have answers to many of them, but they helped try to frame the conversation that we were having about the future of higher ed. I'm sorry I rushed through that because I realized that we wanted to have some time for discussion in the next 20 minutes, and I'm sorry for those in the back possibly didn't hear me in the first couple of minutes, but I'll be willing to engage in that debate, and if you have any questions, please ask them. Thank you.
Why don't we go straight to the questions? I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say, and you're not anxious to hear my throaty voice.
Sure. One of the challenges for traditional universities like ours is online education. For-profits are way ahead in terms of technology and skills. We have a challenge because online education is not cheap for us. In fact, it's more expensive. What do you see the challenge and how to deal with it in the context of a traditional university like at Cal State?
Well, I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago. Everyone is trying to jump on. As Jane said this morning, everybody thinks that, or not everybody, a lot of people think that the silver bullet to the cost question in higher ed is alternative delivery methods, and the most easy one for many people to think about is distance education. And so you've seen all these institutions kind of jump on this bandwagon over the last couple of years trying to copy everyone else. I think we're not only potentially going to see disruption in the traditional higher education market, but I think we potentially can see disruption in the online education market as well. You've seen over the last couple of months a lot of coverage of these massively online open courses. A famous one here, just up the road, not up the road, up the state, by the Stanford professor who had like 50,000 students in one of his courses, and of course has just left his job at Stanford to start his own, to be part of a new online education company. I'm actually participating in one of those courses right now. offered by a professor at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And he already has 25,000 students enrolled in this course on systems thinking. And so I guess the bottom line here is that one institution offering a course for 15, 20, 30 students is going to be quickly kind of overwhelmed by institutions that are able to offer these big courses and potentially do them well. And so I think that, I mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of good stuff in terms of online courses, and there's a lot of really bad stuff out there. I mean, we've all seen it. And I think that you're going to see a shakeout over the next couple of years, especially on the quality question. Just like you're going to see a shakeout in traditional higher ed on the quality question, I think you're going to see that on online education as well. And so part of this idea for traditional higher ed is if you can't do it well, why do it? Are you doing it just because everyone else is doing it? Are you doing it because you could deliver education in a cheaper way? Are you doing it because it adds value to what you're already doing on campus? So for example, I think that in terms of traditional ed, traditional higher ed, there is some arguments for this idea of a hybrid education, where some of the pieces of education could and should be delivered online because potentially students learn better that way in terms of certain courses. That's probably the way to go. But just to jump on that bandwagon because everyone else is on it and you think you're going to save money, you're probably too late to that game. And I'm not quite sure I would argue for going in that way. We had somebody in my, and then I'll open it up to other questions. We had somebody in our office who has worked in traditional higher ed for about the last 30 years recently. He was in last week, and he was talking about how he's meeting with a lot of Wall Street investors who are interested in starting an online engineering program through a traditional university. And they're interested in doing that only at a top 20, 25 university. And actually, it's going to be a public that they're thinking about doing this at. And they want to build kind of the perfect online engineering program. And they basically want to essentially blow everyone else out of the water by doing this. So competing against something like that, I'm not quite sure why somebody with not as many resources, not as much expertise would want to do that. Why don't you, again, figure out what are your ambitions, where can you play, where you can be good at what you're doing instead of trying to do what everyone else is doing. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question. Yeah, way in the back.
Hi there. I was listening to your last slide when you were talking about the questions that education needs to ask itself, and then also your response just now to Dean Puri, and I was actually taken back to a lot of the classes I took in his college that made it sound like that's a business strategy you're proposing. So then how do you respond to people in higher education who say that higher education is not a business and we shouldn't think of it that way?
I had trouble hearing your question. I think you said something like, higher education is not a business, so you should not.
Right. How do you respond to people who say that?
There are key differences, and as I said earlier when I was comparing it to other industries, yes, higher education is, there are nonprofits with, well, most of higher ed, nonprofits, with specific missions. And I think that's really important to think about. But you're now competing, higher ed is now competing in a market that is incredibly different than it was 20 or 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And I think that, the internet has really changed that. That people now can get an education anywhere at any time. And I think that's much different than it was even with the old correspondence courses that you used to have available to you 20 or 30 years ago. So you're competing against these other providers. And as a result, I think that institutions, traditional institutions, need to think in some business ways, knowing that, again, mission drives them. And that mission should continue, your mission should continue to drive everything that you do, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that you ignore kind of the business aspects of your institutions.
I was interested in your definition of college. It left out a word.
One definition.
Okay, it's one definition. Okay. and I hope I'm not answering my own question here, but it left out a word that's very important to me, and that's learning. So I wonder, since you do define it, I'll read it for those who may have forgotten, a bundle of services that results in an education with internal and external value. Could you say something about what you mean by education?
I'm sorry,
Can you,
I'm not
okay.
sure I understand the question.
Can you define what you mean by education?
Sure. So, to me, one of the services that higher ed is providing is obviously learning. So, to me, education. There's a big debate right now, and I mentioned it earlier. Are you training people for a job, or are you providing them kind of the tools to learn, not necessarily for their first job, but for their fifth job? And I think it's a combination of both. And so, to me, education at its basic level, education is providing students with the tools to help them make the critical decisions in their personal life and in their professional life over their lifetimes. But not everybody, but over the course of your lifetime, you're going to also need specific skills that you're actually going to need to learn. And so that's why, to me, education, there's not this either-or argument. And I think this is a very dangerous argument that we're having right now, because I think that institutions of higher education need to provide both. I think you need to provide to a certain segment of students kind of that basic foundation, and to another group of students who may have, maybe 10 years earlier, had that basic level or that basic foundation. They now need to come back to have specific skills. So I don't think there is one specific definition of higher ed, but whenever I write or others talk about kind of the outcomes of higher ed, there always is kind of a response by some who say you can't measure learning, and I think that is really where some of the stuff that Bob was talking about this morning in terms of earnings by major or employment by major. I think having this as one measure, just one measure, helps families decide, or other people interested in higher ed, whether they could potentially be older, going back to school, help them make that decision about where to go. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Jeff, thank you for the presentation. I want to hit on the value, the question of value and becoming much more important variable, because we in the CSU, and at least for the last decade, have been working to try to make the right information, because market imperfection in higher education has certainly been generated by a lack of information. And every time we've forced the issue, and we've had many victories and we've had many defeats on this, and it's been the traditional higher ed establishment that we have had to fight to prove the value of whether it's a CSU education, its earnings potential, its student loan indebtedness, much of what's on the president's scorecard, the college scorecard. Do you see that pressure on the traditional battles that we've had subsiding, or do you see it folding in at some point, and what's going to make that happen? Because those battles go on every time we go to Washington.
Well, I think the key was that slide that I showed about where at the end of the day it's going to equal that parents and students are going to be paying more out of pocket. Okay, so if students and parents can't be using their house as an ATM, if states are going to be pressured and you're going to get less in appropriations, or Cal grants are going to remain stable, or at the federal level, if the maximum Pell Award is not going to be able to be increased like it has been in the last couple of years, all that's going to lead to students and parents being forced to potentially pay more of their higher education out of pocket. When that happens, I think they're going to demand, like most consumers do, more information about the institutions that they're attending. And I think, I could be wrong on this, I think that institutions are going to be forced to give that information. And if CSU is doing it, but your competitors are not, parents are going to respond to that. And so I think that the days of higher ed saying, trust us, especially private higher ed, trust us, we're going to provide value to you. I think those days are really rapidly coming to an end, especially I'm a product of private higher education. And I was just mentioning to somebody that my alma mater yesterday surpassed the $50,000 mark. They just announced tuition for next year, $50,000, which I graduated about 20 years ago. And when I graduated, they had just surpassed the $20,000 mark. So that's more than double in just about 20 years. I have a daughter who's 3 months old. So she will be going to higher ed in about 18 years. And I wonder, are we headed in a direction, I know I'm not an economist, so I know it's not, are we headed in a direction where this is going to be a $100,000 degree? $100,000 a year in 18 years. And parents and students are just going to say enough is enough. And they're going to demand this information. And if schools are unwilling to provide it, I think that they're going to say we're going to go elsewhere. And you're already seeing this. You're already seeing this at what I would call the third and fourth tier small privates. All of those presidents are talking about how they're having a hard time filling seats because those parents and students are making that choice now. They're saying, you know what, it's not worth it.
In that regard, there are some data available. In 2000, the premium for a bachelor's degree over, say, just a high school diploma was about 87%. In other words, you could expect to earn, on average, and that's over, all kinds of majors and so forth, 87% more with a bachelor's degree than with just a high school diploma. By 2009, that number had dropped to only 60%. And with the rising costs, do you think that's going to have a big impact on what parents say about the value of a college degree?
It might. It might in a couple of cases. You saw in that slide that I showed from the College Board the payoff from the degree. And one thing that I didn't mention when I showed that slide, that took into account debt. So you will see that, for example, I think in that slide it was a bachelor's degree didn't surpass the high school diploma until 31, 32 years of age. Mainly that's because, in the 20s that person was paying off their student loan debt. But you had just mentioned what? It's gone from 80-something% to 60%. That's still a huge premium. I don't think that, it's going down. Maybe if it goes down to 10 or 20, perhaps people will be making those decisions. But I think that as long as there's this significant payoff, that I think that people will take that into account, especially in terms of going into debt and also post-secondary, post-college plans. So, if they're going into graduate school, they might just say, hey, I want to spend less on the undergraduate degree. But I think that as long as that premium remains, 20, 30+%, I think it's going to be a really hard argument to say that doesn't help colleges.
One of the big complaints I know that students have is that the cost of textbooks and other materials of that sort keeps going up and up and up. And since you kind of bridge both the publishing and the education business, I wondered how you think that's going to break. I mean, something's going to break, but what do you predict in that area?
Well, one thing I didn't mention about publishing. So I'm going to be publishing a book on higher ed for consumer audience in the spring. And so I've spent the last couple of months getting to know a lot about the publishing industry, the book publishing industry. And on the consumer side, the book publishing industry is controlled by 6 big publishers, big publishing houses. And Amazon recently moved into the publishing industry, into book publishing. And I'm actually going to be published by them, by kind of this new disruptor on the scene. And they're not very well liked in the publishing world because they're starting to do things differently. For example, if I had gone with a traditional publisher, it would have taken 2 years to publish my book. Amazon's going to be able to do it in a year. There's all these things that Amazon is doing on the marketing side and everything else that the traditional publishers have not done. And so I think we are headed in a direction we've seen in a couple of recent examples. One was the announcement by Apple of their new iBooks software. You've also seen, I think one place where this potentially can happen is at the institutional level. where you see a number of institutions now experimenting with this idea of rolling in the cost of textbooks as part of tuition, and then essentially they're doing this bulk purchasing. I think potentially you'll see that. So I think that between technology and this idea of colleges finally using their pricing power and their purchasing power, I think that you're going to see some changes to this in the next couple of years. I think in iBooks especially, it's not just going to be Apple, but it's going to be other technology companies. This ability to kind of create your own textbook, working with institutions, I think that has the potential to bring down textbook costs. Again, I think colleges and students are just going to say enough is enough on that front as well.
I'm wondering if you have disaggregated the public perception by first generation and underrepresented and those who are middle class. I would suspect, especially in California where we're becoming a minority-majority state, the perception of public of what higher ed will do would be different.
Okay, so is that on a question of value?
A question of value, absolutely.
Okay,
question
so
of
what
value.
you're suspecting, so for example, on that slide I showed about what Americans think the value of higher ed is, have we disaggregated that by state, by first generation, by
underrepresented?
By race or ethnicity? We haven't. That data does exist, but we haven't done that. So I don't know what, you might be right. It might be different in that way, but we have not done that. It's actually a good idea. Maybe Jane has something to say.
On that very point, there has been, I think Cal and the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Ed has some disaggregated poll data, and they show that the demand and the value perception is highest among first-generation families. So the disaggregation by race and income was pretty vivid. So those who haven't historically had it place the highest value.
There's one up here in the middle.
How's it going? I just sort of had, I guess, a couple points here. One of the things overall, like the overarching trend that I was trying to establish is, and I know it's not your general, like, it's not your entirety of your opinion, but I kind of want to caution against the notion that education can be summed up as a business, and I know that's not your sort of perspective, but the thing of the matter is that there's sort of a social and cultural value to education that I think is being left out of the equation when we try and view it in this perspective. If we look at it just in terms of American history, just because I'm an American historian, we had sort of the Gilded Age where basically people who had high education advocating for an 8-hour workday and a weekend. And then you move on to the 60s, the other civil rights movement led, and a lot of the time students getting beat up over advocating for civil rights. You can't easily quantify this in terms of dollars and cents value. Psychology, I'm sure most of us would agree, has drastically improved people's lives. These things just aren't easily quantifiable, and I think it goes a little bit above and beyond sort of individual and familial value establishments. So I just sort of wanted to, I guess, caution against that.
Well, and as I said in answer to the previous question about what is education, obviously there is a societal value to higher ed. There is a public good to higher ed. I will also argue, though, that states in particular have given up on that idea. This idea that higher education now is a private good. You will hear lawmakers talk about that a lot of times when they try to cut the budgets of public institutions. You talk to lawmakers about student debt, and when you say, well, the average student debt is $25,000, they'll say, oh, cost of a new car. So this idea that on the political level, I think we've already surpassed that argument. And politicians and people who fund higher ed really believe that it's a private good. And on the college side, the College Board and others put out publications every couple of years talking about how higher education pays. And a lot of it, they talk about the societal good, but a lot of it is in bottom line dollars and cents. So I think on both sides, both the higher education community and the government community has already put it in those terms. And we seem to have kind of lost that public good argument in some ways. I don't know. Some people might disagree and say it's not worth giving up that fight, but I think that we have, on so many levels, lost that fight about the public good.
Have you looked at the needs and the value of higher education for returning adults? And also the growth or the need for more graduate programs to honor those particular professional goals of returning adults as the evolution of different disciplines and professions in society will emerge?
I am not familiar, Jane might know this hopefully, in terms of the payoff for returning adults. I'm sure there's information on that, but maybe not. Okay. No, I don't on that front. On kind of there has been obviously a large increase in graduate programs and other programs for returning adults. A lot of that the great credential race that I showed for last decade was focused on kind of lower level certificate programs and on higher level graduate programs. And this is also where the for-profits in particular had a huge increase in the last decade by going after kind of credentializing areas that 20 years ago we didn't have credentials for. And I know, I've written a lot of pieces about for-profits over the years, and I've been in classrooms at for-profit classrooms, and talking to most of those students, it's really about the credential to get ahead. So, you're talking to somebody who has a bachelor's degree, or you're talking to somebody who has a high school diploma, and their stories are very similar in that, I was up for promotion, and I needed to have a master's degree, or I needed to have a bachelor's degree, and I didn't, so I went back for that. So if you're measuring it just by kind of, not necessarily on the earnings, but on kind of career progression, that has obviously been incredibly important to them, and I think that's where the for-profits have they went after that market during their great growth era of last decade.
One more, and then we'll have a break.
So what do you think are the key lessons higher ed should learn from the disruptions and or recoveries that occurred in the three industries you mentioned?
Oh, I hope you do better than we did. I wanted to be a journalist my whole life, and the journalism industry is still strong, but it's much different. The fact that newsrooms are a third smaller than they were 10 years ago is in some ways good because you kind of democratized news reporting and writing. But at the same time, I think some of the great debates, I think the stuff that King was talking about, what's happening in Sacramento here, I think that if you had perhaps stronger newspapers and stronger news organizations that better inform the public, would we have that much dysfunction today? I don't know. That's a good question, right? Newspapers maybe didn't do a good job covering that 20 years ago, but I would argue that we probably wouldn't have as much dysfunction today as if we had better and more reporters in state houses covering what's actually happening there. So the lesson to me is, it goes back to those first couple of questions, is, people in the news business had this hubris that, and they had monopolies in many towns, and felt, we own the corner on this market, and we're always going to own the corner on this market, so we don't have to change. They were unwilling to realize what was happening with the internet, especially. They were unwilling to charge for their product, which is, I think, the biggest mistake that newspapers made. So I would go back to those leading questions that I put up in the beginning. This idea, don't think you're necessarily the best in the world. Be willing to listen to alternative ideas, and be open to research that might go against your long-held convictions. I think on all three of those fronts, I think that higher ed might be more open to it. I don't know. I mean, every time I write about this, people in higher ed tell me, I always hear this is the new normal. I've been hearing that for 20 years. I keep hearing this time is different. I've been hearing that for 20 years. I could be sitting here in 10 years and you could be laughing at this presentation because everything's the same. I don't know if you want to take that risk. I'm not saying that higher ed needs to change drastically, but it at least needs to be open to these alternative ideas. It needs to focus on what it does well and kind of figure out how to shed the rest. And it needs to be of more value to the people who use it.
Jeff, thank you very much.